Hello, Bermuda, and welcome to the very first episode of This Week in Government. I'm Tarai Trott. This Week in Government is a new CITV program that's aimed at providing you with first-hand and insightful information as shared by the movers and shakers in government. This Week in Government will offer the viewer engaging and enlightening commentary about government's initiatives, programs, policies, events, and activities, and how they affect the lives of Bermudians. Today, for our introductory episode, we are pleased to have with us the Premier and Minister of Finance, the Honourable David Burt, JP MP. As the public is aware, the government has been going through the 2023-24 budget process, so today we're excited that Premier Burt is here with us to discuss some topical aspects of the 2023-24 budget. Mr. Premier, welcome.
Hey, it's Rai, good to be here.
In discussing the theme of this year's budget, it was put as a path to continued economic growth. Firstly, can you share with us for this budget to tell us about the work that goes into creating a national budget? For instance, the process for those who don't typically follow a government process.
Thank you, Sarai. Well, the budget process starts in earnest in September every year. And so technical officers inside of the ministries work with their various ministers to put together the plans that they plan to advance in the next budget year. And these plans are typically aligned with the government's promises, from whether it be the throne speech, previous budget statements, or the government's election platform. Because despite whatever policies that you may want to put in place, you have to make sure that funding is aligned to advance those policies. An example of such of those policies would be the transitional living facility, which was an announcement in 2020 in the election manifesto, something that was put inside of the throne speech and something that was funded in this budget to ensure that children who age out of care can have a transition to make sure they can live independent lives. So we take a look at all of those items, put them together. The Ministry of Finance will receive all of those submissions and then determine what is the level of overall spending for the government. We have a 3-year path, which is laid out every budget year, which gets updated, and it takes into account the latest economic data, sees how well our economy is growing, the amount of tax revenues that are coming into the country, and then we will look at that and say the level of deficit we want to have is this, and if that's the level of deficit, the target that we have, we know that we have to have this much revenue and this much expenditure. Now this year, the revenue levels and expenditure levels were increased. We've seen from the growing economy, specifically with the growth of international business, which has increased by about 15% over the last 3 years. We've seen significant additional tax revenue that has come from that area, in addition to the recovering economy, whether it be on the tourism side or just broadly. And so from that aspect, we were able to say we can support a higher level of spending, both on the current account side, which is the amount for daily operations to fund things such as healthcare, to fund things such as social protections, to fund things such as the security services, and also the capital side, which is the investments, the building, the roads, the new facilities, which are necessary and required to continue to deliver government services. So when all of those are put together, we have the revenue line, we have the current account line, and then we have the capital expenditure line. And all those are put together to arrive at a budget where we are predicting a budget deficit of about $40 million this year, which is slightly over the predicted amount of $35 million last year. But we've been able to increase spending on current account by $20 million, which is certainly going to provide support for the hospital and security services, in addition to social initiatives, while also having record capital investment and the highest capital investment budget that has been put forward to the Parliament in 15 years.
You know, Premier, one question I get asked about this budget is, how does it fund the services needed to improve quality of life on the island?
Well, there's a number of things that are inside of this budget which are important, and they go back to the platform initiative. So when I speak to the fact of transitional living for children out of care, but one of the things that is also important for young persons in the community or young parents in the community is the cost of childcare. We've seen this throughout the world, and we know that childcare is an increasing expense. We are funding in this budget provision for increased daycare allowances for young parents. Right now, the cutoff is $60,000. That's going to be increased, and we're going to make sure that persons can get support even if they're making above the threshold right now of $60,000, because we know that parents are stretched in trying to make those ends meet. Additional items which are funded, which help, in my constituency, for instance, air quality monitoring for matters related to Belco emissions is also something that's funded. Increased funding for the hospital, increased funding for security services, increased funding for education, to deliver education reform and to make sure that when we have new parish primary schools, they are equipped with the new and latest technology to make sure that we have better learning environments. So there's a number of things throughout which are done. And we can even look insofar as the justice system to make sure there's increased funding for the justice system so that we can handle cases more efficiently, clear some of the backlogs, and make sure there's an efficient administration of justice. So there are a number of various things that have been put inside this budget to make sure that the services that the government delivers can be delivered in a better fashion, which increase the quality of life in Bermuda.
Premier, you're a person who obviously is very active on social media, and as you're aware, there's some anxiety about this budget. Can you share with us, or rather you indicated first of all that we were reporting strong economic numbers. Can you share some examples of the numbers that indicate that the economy is indeed turning around?
Well, we've seen tax receipts is one of the best indicators that you can see that the economy is growing. And we've seen tax receipts even went up last year by 7%. And last year, there were no increase in tax at all. In fact, there were tax decreases that went into effect last year because you want to make sure that when an economy is trying to recover, that you are not adding additional taxes overall into the economy. And so on the back of tax decreases last year, we saw increased revenue. That is a sign of economic strength. We know that tourism is recovering. We know that international business is growing. We do know that there's a private investment. We have seen the amount of new construction projects which have been approved for starting continue to remain at a high level. So we know that there is certainly activity which is taking place there, and that's also supported by the government's capital expenditure program as well. But the challenge that people are feeling is the impacts of inflation. And inflation is something that is not under the control of government. We see that on a global basis. And so from that aspect, I know that people have personal anxiety for their finances. The question is, how does a government respond in the best way? And if we look at the fact of the duty reductions of which we had on essential food items, if you look at the fact of the wide breadth of payroll tax cuts of which we put in place this year, which is built on a record of payroll tax cuts that we've had over the last 6 years, the government is making sure that working people have more money in their pockets to cope with the challenges of which they're facing. And that is the way that you have to approach government financial policy, as it's called fiscal policy, which is tax and spending policy, to ensure that the government is able to provide as much relief where relief is needed.
Premier, you indicated that payroll tax reductions are planned for this budget. Can you expand on what that means for workers and their employers?
Well, there is no business in the country that will pay more payroll tax. And I think it will be a long time if you go back to find out the last time that we actually decrease the payroll tax amount for businesses. It's been significant. They are always going up. And I've always been of the perspective that payroll tax is a disincentive for job creation. So we want to reduce that burden. So for some small businesses, they will see a reduction in their tax burden of up to 43%. That means that they're going to be paying 43% less taxes next year than they did this year. Now that will make a difference to small businesses, that will make a difference to medium-sized businesses, and they will also make a difference to large businesses who we've also reduced their payroll tax rate. But what we've done on the employee side, which is not what the business is responsible for, but what individuals are responsible for, we've also reduced those taxes for 86% of workers. And so that means anyone who is making $132,000 or less will pay less in payroll tax next year. And that is a significant amount of workers that will see payroll tax relief. The contrary side to that, of course, is those persons making above $132,000 will see some increases, and the largest increases will be in place for those persons who are making over $500,000 a year. And I think that it's important to note and to recognize that there are some persons who are doing well, and persons who are making over $500,000 a year are less impacted than inflation than those persons who are making $66,000 a year, which is the median income. But one statistic that I'd want to give, the median income in Bermuda is around $66,000. And persons who are making $66,000 would have saved an accumulative, since this time that the Progressive Labour Party government came in and have been reducing taxes, would have seen a tax savings of $4,000.
For those looking at the fine details of this budget, they would have taken notice of the emphasis or focus on infrastructure, with a pledge of $95 million for infrastructure projects. Can you tell us more about what we can see in terms of improvements to our infrastructure projects? For example, does it translate into more jobs for some projects?
Certainly, anything that has infrastructure spending will require persons to be hired to deliver that. And so there is certainly going to be an aspect of job creation there. But when we look at it from infrastructure spending, it's to make sure that our infrastructure is resilient for the future. We've had a period of time where we've had to try to consolidate our books. That means to get us to a balanced budget. And in that time, one of the, I guess I would say, the parts that were less funded were on the capital expenditure side. Capital expenditure is when you're talking about things such as roads, when you're talking about things such as buildings, when you're talking about things such as buses and ferries, the infrastructure that the government is required to have in order to deliver services. So in this, there's replacements for more vehicles, for whether it's the police, fire service, prison service, whether or not that's vehicles for the public works department to upgrade and to replace equipment. For a while, we haven't even had working tractors that can clear seaweed off of beaches. It is for additional buses, electric buses, which are coming in. It's also for ferry refits. It's also for the facilities that host these places. But the most important things in here are significant funding for Tynes Bay. We know that we are a country that is fortunate to have a waste incinerator, which means that we no longer landfill our waste, but that is something that requires continued investment. Last year, we saw that we had to temporary landfill. This is to make sure that we don't return to that situation again. Also, there's significant funding to fund the building of parish primary schools so that when Purvis and Francis Patton open next year, they not only have new classrooms that are fitted for P7 and P8, but they also have the new equipment and facilities inside of there. There's been capital funding that has been set aside for a new clinic in the west end of the island to make sure that those persons can have ready access to community health services and not have to travel all the way to the city of Hamilton. And there's additional funding for, I think, what most people would like to see is additional funding for road paving inside the country. So when we talk about the capital expenditure budget, and one more thing I want to add is there's also funding for additional affordable housing. So all these things inside the capital budget are to make sure that when we talk about a path to continued economic growth, we must make sure that we continue to invest for the future. If you want to have economic growth, you realize that there'll be more people living and working in Bermuda, and we have to make sure that we have the infrastructure that can accommodate those persons and can make sure that we can travel safely on public transport, can travel safely on our roads, and can make sure that we have modern facilities for our students to be educated for the future.
Our international business partners, such as ABIR, contend that this budget actually increases the cost of doing business, such as the cost for employment, and that this budget shifts the tax burden to international business companies. Do you agree with that assessment?
I do not agree with that assessment, and here is why. Our payroll tax system has a separate amount that is for employers and a separate amount that is for employees. There is no employer in Bermuda who has seen taxes increase in this budget. In the pre-budget report, there was a proposal to increase taxes on exempted companies. We left that tax rate where it was. So there has not been an increase in that area. Where there has been an increase is an increase on the taxes that are payable by employees for higher salaries. Some international business companies, not all, but some elect to pay that for their employees. And if they do elect to pay that for their employees, then that means that they may see the amount of taxes of which they pay go up. But that is a choice that the business has made, not as a result of government policy, because those taxes are payable by the employee. And we recognize, of course, that, as we said earlier, for those persons who are making $500,000 to $1 million, we'll see a significant increase in their taxes, where their effective tax rate is going to go from about 9% to 11%. So from that perspective, there will certainly be some increases that have been felt there. But if you look at it from a broader context, those persons, if they are working in London, would be paying over 45%. Those persons that are in New York would be paying close to 40% or higher when state taxes are taken into account. And so the tax level in Bermuda is not high on a global comparative basis. And we're going to continue to work with international business to streamline our operations to this country to make sure that Bermuda remains competitive and a place where they want to continue to grow. But at the core of the government's objective is to make sure that we are being fair. And we believe that it is fair to reduce the tax burden for workers in this country who are suffering under the impacts of inflation and offset that by an increase in those persons that are certainly at the higher level who can more readily afford those tax changes.
On the subject of Morgan's Point, for instance, you announced a very ambitious plan to expand on that proposed development. Just curious, can you tell us why it was decided to take that course of action?
Well, there's been a lot of analysis that has happened for Morgan's Point, and it's been a particular challenge for this government. It's a particular challenge when you look at the fact that when we were in opposition, we did not support the provision of a $165 million guarantee. That project was in technical default of its arrangements in government even before the 2017 general election. So when we look back on it, we had a $165 million guarantee which came due. That was compiled with penalties and interest payments as well. There were payments that were not made to vendors, which are small businesses in this community that had spent money on their payroll that were expecting money back. And there was also the need to maintain that facility. The total amount of spending that the government has had to put into Morgan's Point to this point in time has been $215 million. It has been significant. And the view that was espoused by the former Minister of Finance and supported by the cabinet and the government as a whole is that we need to get our money back. There was a lot of analysis that was done on what is the best way for the government to recoup funds, to continue as a hotel, to try to sell the property, or examine other options. After all the analysis, it was felt that the government should expand, turn what is there into different levels of housing, and to create a new space, a new destination centered with an amenity village, which will have retail, restaurants, and additional housing that will be in the affordable range that will allow that site to return money to the government over time. We know that we have a housing challenge in Bermuda, and we know that this can also support that aim and objective. It will also provide employment in construction, and what it will do in the long term is be able to return the money to the government of which the money has spent out. There's additional plans to expand it to include seniors housing and other types of housing in future phases. So we believe that it is a good use of the site for the long term to support the country's long-term growth ambitions. The Minister of Economy and Labor has been very clear. We have to make sure there are more people living and working in Bermuda. And if we are true to that mission and vision, we have to make sure there are more places for people to live and to enjoy. And we believe that the Morgan's Point plans which have been unveiled achieve that aim.
And speaking of housing, the mortgage guarantee program was raised during this budget. Can you share any updates regarding this program?
Well, certainly. The Mortgage Guarantee Program is something that we are very proud of. It's something that we promised in our 2020 election manifesto, that we will take action to help young people get on the housing ladder. We know that there are 12 persons who have achieved the ability to buy their first house who would not have been able to do so without this program coming into place. And now we are expanding it. So before there was an age limit of persons that had to be 40 and under. We've now expanded that so there is no particular age limit. We're also saying that public officers who may qualify to move their mortgages to the Bermuda Commercial Bank underneath this program can apply to do so as well. So we're expanding the amount of persons who are able to access this facility because while interest rates are rising, we want to ensure that persons have the ability to access lower rates of mortgages, which may be squeezing many families. But also one of the things that which we've done during this budget session is that we have raised the first-time home buyer stamp duty limit, where persons have to pay stamp duty when they buy a first house. We've now raised that limit from $750,000 to $1 million, and we've also eliminated taxes for the transferring of mortgages. So if you have your mortgage at a particular bank, not all banks have raised interest rates as high as some, you can now transfer your mortgage to a different bank and not worry about having to pay a stamp tax bill or stamp duty bill to the government because any transfers under $1 million will be tax-free. So what we're trying to do is to relieve as much of the tax burden inside the housing market to give people the freedom to choose and to move their mortgages without worrying about the additional tax of which they may have to pay to the government.
Premier, our time together is winding down. Are there any final thoughts that you wish to share?
No, I think that I would like to congratulate you on this new program. I think that it will be informative and will help. And I think that it's important that people can go to the website, www.gov.bm/budget, can look at all of the various budget items. We'll continue to put out more information, and we'll be sending information to all households because budgets are important. And the approach of which we take is that budgets are about the people of this country. We go through a very transparent budget process with our pre-budget report, and I want persons to always know that they are free to give feedback on any budget items. Some of the things inside this budget came from the public, and that is what democracy is about. So we want people to continue to remain actively engaged in the budgeting process because soon the budget process will start again, and we'll be looking at next year's budget as we plan on making sure that we achieve our objective of getting to a balanced budget for this country.
Well, thank you very much, Premier, for your time today. We appreciate you joining us. And that concludes our very first episode of This Week in Government. I'm Tarai Trott. Thank you for joining us.